Hello there. This video is what I want to do for a little bit. This is a book I just finished reading over the summer. It is Stephen Jay Gould's Dinosaur in a Haystack, published in 1995, and like most of his books, they were originally published in Natural History magazine, and after so many of them, they collaborates to them. I just got reading this back a month ago now. Although I remember seeing this on the bookshelves back in '95, I was 15 years old. This was where the huge dinosaur craze was about after Jurassic Park came out. It's amazing how that movie will be 20 years old next year. And it's one of those things that, like, most people would think, God, I feel old, but I never felt old on such things. But after all these years, I finally picked up a copy at Hastings, and I decided to read this through, and I always like reading his stuff. It's kind of like reading an anthology of a certain theme. In this case, it's histories of science, in particular with their connections with biology and evolution. Some of the essays I do like, may seem kind of odd to talk about. One of them, The Left Snails and Right Minds. It was an essay about how when you take a snail shell and hold it upright a certain way with the apex on the top, and you see it swirl around, and whatever side of the opening it will be, whether it's on the left hand or the right hand, if you imagine a imaginary line down the middle of it, it is considered left or right-handed. Not using any, that's not too technical terminologies in that. But one thing that the author notices in his essay, that if you looked at older printed stuff, they would do the acid etchings and stuff like that, but they were all backwards. And throughout the essay, he talks about how is it that these guys who know, why did they just draw it backwards and then print it, that way when it's printed it'll be shown correctly. Because a lot of the illustrations at the time, vast majority of the snail shells would have a left opening, even though most of the snail shells you'll find in nature are right. And another one, Poe's Greatest Hits, that one, if you like Edgar Allan Poe, you might find this essay interesting. How this guy, even though Poe never made much on his writings, his greatest one is on writing about snail shells, and there was a bit of a scam going on at the time. The Monsters Human Nature I found very interesting. If you ever find people who commonly use that old cliche of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is a book about how man should not interfere with nature, and Gould points out that never once in the book will you find a passage that says in Frankenstein indicates that man should not toy in God's domain or things like that. Where in actuality the monster himself was capable of such goodness, but society, viewing him in his visual hideousness, shunned him, and that's how he became a monster. Very good read, especially if you're a Frankenstein fan and you're tired of that. You're tired of that old cliche of saying, "Oh, well, that's just man should interfere with science," and people actually buying into that and thinking that's a good lesson. Well, that essay shows that that's not really the case. The movies portrayed it that way, and every Hollywood movie after that, following that old cliche, believes that because they can't seem to bring good ideas to the public. Let's see, next one, Cabinet Museums, Alive O, kind of a weird title. It's about Gould's couple trips to Dublin and Trinity College, particularly to the Museum of Natural History there. He visited the first time, and it was all dusted and completely in decay. And I think he described it as a Victorian style. And he kind of shows that people, the way he looked at it is the way how a lot of people view Victorian era style and architecture and stuff like that. But then they cleaned it up and showed this museum how they used to do these natural history museums. If you go to places like Sam Noble here in Norman, Oklahoma, it's a very good museum, but it's kind of spacious, and a lot of museums like that will put in interactive technology, put some interactive toys and stuff for people to play with and such like that. Not that there's too many over at Sam Noble, but places like that. Victorian museums, you would see like example like a small window case, and it would be packed full of beetles or butterflies of all the varieties and beauties. And it's accumulating so much to see the varieties of nature as much as they can. Kind of makes you want to go there. And of course he has like a section in the book there talking about the misapplication of eugenics from people who don't, from people in the past. One that particularly interests me was, does the stoneless plum instruct a thinking reed? It's about a guy who was very famous for finding very specific types of plants. He would breed these plants till he chose the one with the right thing. He was described that he would make these huge fields until he had such a great attention to detail, and he would and then he'd find the one that had the right traits that he want, and use that, burn the rest of the crop, but use that to breed more like it, so you now have a whole community. And then later he brings out this book, and that kind of gave more on a lighter side of eugenics, how more positive manner, not the one where you just eliminate all the inferior races, but to try to breed all the good parts about that. And Gould attacks where his arguments fail. It's like the guy got it half right to the point, but the last 2 points was where he bungled it, and Gould points that out. It's a very good idea on how people used to think back then. But of course, there's the essay that has that's titled, as the title of the book, "Dinosaur in a Haystack." A very interesting one, to where it shows how paleontologists who were used to the idea of Darwinian gradualism, that it was kind of hard to think out of that, and he brings this up in the form of when Dr. Alvarez, who discovered the Cretaceous Tertiary meteor impact, at the time, many paleontologists were against this. Because the fossil record from their observations of digging and all that showed that dinosaurs and ammonites, who went extinct at the Cretaceous, they were gradually dwindling in number before the KT boundary. So they're like, well, they were slowly dying out anyway. The meteor impact couldn't have been the main cause. So Gould thought, well, why not just look further and see if it is? And he makes the analogy of a needle in a haystack, to where if you grab a handful and then look through that to find the needle, you won't find the needle. But if you take it out one straw at a time, you will eventually find the needle. And, you'll look at it very closely. So why not do a thing like that when it comes to digging fossils? And it's not because they're lazy. Paleontologists themselves are search for fossils as thoroughly as they can. And he puts it plainly, because the world is huge and life is short. But with some paleontologists looking a little bit deeper, like Peter Ward, who studies ammonites, he would look at that 30 feet of strata before the KT boundary, and he would find piece and piece here of ammonites, showing that maybe that they weren't so gradually dying out if they just keep looking. But all the essays here are great reads, and like a good anthology story, you could read one chapter at a time in its own separate thing, so you could go at your own pace. And he covers a whole slew of wonderful topics about that. I recommend that and any other book that Gould writes. The first one I read was Bully for Brontosaurus, and I found that at the Sam Noble Museum. I gave my first copy away to a friend of mine who, when he moved back to Texas, so I picked up a hardcover at Barnes & Noble, and the essay in that book, Bully for Brontosaurus, I was particularly drawn to because he mentions a series of stamps from the late 80s, which I have a strip of, and it talks about a more detailed story and shows how people have misconceived the idea, how the old story of the Brontosaurus turned to a Apatosaurus because the wrong head was found. He gives details first about bringing up the stamps and how people were up in arms against the Postal Service, say, hey, you labeled one of those Brontosaurus, that's not Brontosaurus, that's a Apatosaurus. So at first he goes about and tells the basic rules on how nomenclature works in biology. And then later he would talk about the history of Brontosaurus and Apatosaurus, how O.C. Marsh found the Apatosaurus first, found another species, thought it was a different one, and but then, long story short, they corrected it back in the early 1900s. But Brontosaurus became something that was cultural, not scientific. And then he later points out the real error that these guys should be thinking about: the Pteranodon in that stamped collection not being a dinosaur at all. That was a real error. And it's all taken with good humor. How he kind of pokes fun of the people up in arms against the Postal Service. And this is from a former paleontologist himself. Gould died back in 2002, unfortunately. Would have loved to meet him. But anyway, here it is. Dinosaur in a Haystack, Stephen Jay Gould. Check it out, or any of his other works. He's got quite a bit of books, and are wonderful reads if you like science, biology in particular, and histories of science, or you just like history. Well, that does it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it there. See you next time.